So I got a ton of comments in my last video asking about this PC behind me. The main two questions were how much did it cost and what are the specs and parts. So today I'm going to walk you through my process of shopping and building this thing. Hey, welcome back to Reality Tech. So in this video I'm going to walk you through my parts list for that computer back there. I brought up PC Part Picker here. I'm just going to go through the list of the parts that I got. So there's going to be a lot of editing in this video to do, but that's fine. I like it anyway. And I'm just going to kind of explain my shopping process, how I got things so cheap. I know the market is pretty crazy right now with the graphics card prices specifically being so high. So I'm just going to walk through how to stay in budget and also how to save money in places of things that aren't so necessary. So the first thing I'm going to start with is the case. The case for this computer, I went with a CompuCase, I believe is the brand, HEC HX300. It was a good budget case. I spent about $35 on it. It's a mid-tower case, so it can hold, I believe it was able to hold an ATX motherboard, although mine is micro ATX. It's a nice design. It looks great. It's got an acrylic side panel, although the main drawback to this case is it doesn't have a lot of cooling. Not really any vents in the front or top, and I think it only has one small case fan spot in the back, which I'm actually not even using. I do want to get a case fan. I'm just trying to get one that's not going to need to be loud. So the next thing I want to cover is the power supply. I'm just kind of going in order of the things I would add when building the computer itself. My power supply that I currently have in that computer was one that we had laying around. It's like a 610 watt. It's pretty unusual, but I'm going to include a different one in this build list because it's still a really good option, and it's one that I bought recently for the second build that I mentioned in the last video. So the power supply that I'm going to add to this list was the Corsair CX650M. So 650 watts. It's a modular power supply, which means you only need to add as many cables to the power supply as you need for your build, and you're not going to have extra cables laying around hidden in your case somewhere. I got the CX650M for about $45, I believe it was, on OfferUp. It was used, but in like new condition, and it is still under warranty, so even if it didn't work, I could just replace it. So next, I'm going to move on to the motherboard. The motherboard I have in my computer is an ASRock B450M Pro 4. That is a mouthful, but ASRock is the brand. B450 is the chipset, which is essentially the list of features that you get with this specific one. So there's things like A320, B450, X570. Those are all options that all have their own pros and cons. The higher you go, the more expensive, obviously. So B450 was a good amount of features for me, including things like overclocking if I needed it, which I did for the RAM, without needing too many of the fancy features that you find on high-end ones like a lot of RGB control and stuff like that. So the ASRock B450M Pro 4 that I went with was $75. I got that one on Amazon. Alright, next I want to move on to the RAM. My RAM in this computer, I don't remember what it is, let me check. So the RAM that I went with in this build was Team T-Force Vulcan Z 16 gigabytes. I went with two 8 gig sticks so that I could upgrade in the future if I wanted to. It's DDR4, which is determined by the CPU and the motherboard. Those all need to be in spec with each other. And DDR4 stands for double data rate, and then 4 is the generation. There's a lot of videos on that you can find pretty easily if you need explanation on what those numbers mean. So some of the specs on this RAM, it is 16 gigs like I said, which is two 8 gigabyte sticks. The speed of this was 3200 megahertz if you use XMP. That's another thing that the B450 motherboard allows you to do, is use XMP, which stands for Extreme Media Profile, and it's basically a mixture between stabilizing your RAM and making it perform more stably and reliably, but also overclocking it. So without XMP, this RAM was, I believe, 2400 megahertz, and then overclocking it got it to 3200. The CAS latency, or CL latency, of this RAM is 16. I have no idea what that means. I got this RAM from Newegg for $45. You really gotta shop around to get that kind of prices now. Last I looked, I believe it was about 75. So I got in right before a lot of the prices jumped, which I'm glad I was able to. So next I'm going to move on to the CPU, or the processor. CPU stands for Central Processing Unit, and it's explained a lot as the brain of the computer. The CPU I went with was a Ryzen 5 3600X. I got it for a really good deal. I believe it was about
$200.
And it's hard to find at that price now, but it's a great processor. It's got 6 cores, runs at 3.8 gigahertz, or can be overclocked to 4.1 gigahertz. Is pretty much just the speed it runs at, how fast it can do calculations. Gosh, I sound like such a nerd. Calculations. So my CPU I got on Amazon for about
$200,
like I said, and the cooler that's on it, which is the bright shiny fan you can see in the background, that I actually stole from the other build I mentioned, the Ryzen 5 3600X. The stock cooler it came with was, I believe it's called a Wraith Spire cooler. It was a circle cooler, and it didn't have any lights. The main reason I stole the other one is because this one is a lot quieter because it's bigger and has more airflow with the fans. But also the computer that it would have gone into didn't have a window, so there's no reason to put that cooler in there with the nice lights when the plain one could work just as good. So next, on to the graphics card, which is the sort of unicorn on the market right now that are hard to get. My graphics card, I went with a NVIDIA GTX 1650 Super. I went with an MSI Gaming X Trio or something like that. I'm not too familiar with a lot of the different variations of the boards, mostly just the cards themselves and what their performance is. The 1650 Super was a good balance of new but also affordable because a lot of new stuff was coming out. The obvious RTX 3000 series was announced right after I got mine, so there was a sort of generation move that people knew was coming. So grabbing mine right then, I got it for $130, which is unheard of now. You can find the same ones for $500, $600 now, because of the shortage. But that aside, I got mine on Amazon used, and it was still under warranty as well, so I could replace it if I needed to. The next thing I'm going to go over is storage. I already had a lot of my drives. In fact, I don't think I've bought any except for an upgrade at some point, but it wasn't included with the build initially. I had an Intel drive of some kind in it before, so now what I'm using is a Viper NVMe 256 gigabyte drive. It's a good balance because a lot of my stuff I'm not storing on the C drive. I have other terabyte drives, hard drives that are separate. Some are in the dock and some are in the computer. It could go either way. It could get really expensive, or it could be almost nothing compared to the rest of the budget. Storage is something that you have to consider for your own budget and needs. SSD, solid state drive, is a digital drive that can work almost instantly compared to an HDD, which is hard disk drive. Hard drives are physical disks that need to turn in order to read the data and write the data off of them, whereas solid state drives, all the data is readily available. So the last thing I'm going to go over is an easy part to overlook when going through your budget, which is the operating system. I'm using Windows 10 Pro. There are different balances to Windows 10 Home and Windows 10 Pro, but the reason I went with Pro is not so much for the features as much as the ability to tweak it with things like local group policy, and domain joining. I use group policy and registry editing a lot for tweaks. I'll probably have a video on some of those eventually. The thing about Windows is I believe it's about $150 base price, but I use OEM keys, original equipment manufacturers, which is if someone buys a lot of Windows 10 keys, activation codes basically, they can get them at a bulk or discount price, which will end up being a lot cheaper, and then if they don't use them, they're able to sell them off later. The issue with buying an OEM key is you won't get as much support from Microsoft on issues you're having with Windows, but I haven't encountered a lot of issues that I wasn't able to figure out on my own. And the other thing you need to consider is the activation. Normal Windows license, you'll just type it in and hit enter and Windows is activated, no problem. OEM keys, you're going to need to call them. So normally what happens, you put in the key, it'll say it's already used on another computer or something like that. It'll give you a phone number to call, and I've done it probably 4 or 5 times now and never had any issue. You just give them a code, and sometimes they'll give you another code that you put in and Windows gets activated, or they will wait a minute and they'll tell you just to let Windows troubleshoot it, and then it'll work. So for Windows, since I use an OEM key, I'm going to add it at about $35 in the budget. I've seen it for $40. I've gotten it for $28 in other bundles. And I've even seen it for like $15 in some other places on different websites, with like sponsor codes from creators that build PCs for a living and need to install Windows and activate it a lot so that they don't need to spend so much money per build. So with that all added up, I spent about $595 on my build. These were just estimates. The prices are very different now, and I don't think I matched them up exactly. I think I actually ended up spending closer to $575 when I built the computer. Maybe that extra price is from upgrading to the NVMe drive, but I think that's a good place to call it. $600 is great for a build. I've seen a lot of videos called "Don't Overspend on Your Computers," and he says you don't need to overspend. You only need to spend about $1,100. So $600 is great for this performance this thing gets. I built it for gaming because if it can do gaming well, it's very likely it's going to be able to do a lot of other things well, whether it's video editing or regular work. So there is my build list, and the price that I paid for it. If I had any tips for someone who wanted to build, and especially on a budget, my first tip would be to have patience, shop around on different websites like Amazon, Newegg, B&H Photo. There's a lot of different companies. You can just do your own research and see where people are most comfortable buying. So my second tip would be, don't be afraid to buy used. My graphics card is used. I haven't had any issues with it. My storage is used just because I've been using it for years before I built this computer. My power supply could be considered used because it is something we had around. But again, like I said, the one that I included in the build was also used. My case wasn't used, but that was cheap. My motherboard was not used, but I wasn't comfortable buying used with that specifically because motherboards, along with the CPU, which also wasn't used, can be a bit more temperamental than some of the other stuff. My RAM wasn't used for this specific build because I found it so cheap. I've built with used RAM before, and I personally haven't had any issues with it so far. My third and final tip is related to the second one, which is don't be afraid to ask questions. It's worth the embarrassment if someone is going to try to sell you something without specifically stating something that's maybe broken about it. Like in the case of a motherboard that I used for another build, I asked the question and it turned out it was missing something. They said it's not going to come in the original box, but everything's there. And I said, does it have the CPU backplate? And they said, no, it doesn't, because they didn't know that was included with the motherboard, not a CPU. But I was able to buy a replacement one on Amazon just as easy, pretty much the exact same thing you would get with the motherboard. More questions you can ask are things like, has it been overclocked? Have you experienced issues with it in the past? And have you tested it before listing it? So in the case of a graphics card, has it been used for mining maybe? In the case of RAM, has it been tested, or have you ever had any issues with it? With power supplies, you can ask if it's ever had any issues, if it's ever stopped working, if there's ever been burning smells, the obvious questions you can ask. And CPUs are a really big one, asking if it's been overclocked, because it can, in theory, shorten the life of it. I personally am not too afraid of it, but if someone says they've heavily overclocked something for years, maybe it's worth steering away from and seeing if you can find something a little newer or better taken care of. So there you go. That is my build, my specs, and my tips for someone who may want to get into budget building. I actually highly suggest it. It was a great experience. I had a lot of fun, and I hope that if you ever get into building yourself, that this video was helpful in having some patience and finding good parts for your system. So that's all I have for today. Thanks for watching. Comment below if you've ever actually played a full game of Monopoly, and remember, the object of golf is to play the least amount of golf. New video coming soon.